welcome back to part 2 of this deep dive. In the previous video, we uncovered the disturbing origins of this dark chapter in history. We will be going even deeper, piecing together what really happened and why it still matters today. If you're new to the channel, this is the perfect time to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and go back to part 1 so you have the full context. When you're caught up, come right back here, because this is where we explore the shocking details that most history books won't tell you. Let's continue our investigation and shed light on what truly happened. There are moments in history so devastating that they seem to shatter the very idea of civilization. We are traveling back to February 1945 to the final, desperate months of the Second World War. The war was nearly over, Germany was collapsing, the Allies were closing in, and yet one of the most horrific acts of destruction of the entire war was still to come. I'm talking about Dresden, once called the Florence of the Elbe, a city renowned for its art, its music, its architecture, its culture. A city that, within a matter of hours, was turned into a roaring inferno that killed tens of thousands of people and left survivors wandering through a smoking wasteland that looked like the surface of another planet. The firebombing of Dresden is one of the darkest and most haunting episodes of the 20th century, a moment that still sparks fierce debate about whether it was a military necessity or an act of pure terror. And as we dive into this story, I want you to feel the dread of that night, to see the orange glow on the horizon, to hear the sound of sirens screaming and bombs whistling through the night sky, and to imagine what it was like to be trapped inside a firestorm so intense that it sucked the very air from your lungs. In early 1945, Dresden was one of the few German cities that had been relatively untouched by the war. While Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and many others had been bombed repeatedly, Dresden had remained largely intact, its Baroque beauty surviving in a sea of destruction. Refugees from all over Germany flocked there, hoping to escape the chaos of the advancing Soviet army. By February, Dresden was swollen with hundreds of thousands of civilians, women, children, the elderly, wounded soldiers, prisoners of war. The population may have doubled or even tripled in those last weeks, making the city not just a cultural center but a massive human shelter. And that is when the decision was made, wound by British and American planners, to erase it. The night of February 13, 1945, was cold, clear, and silent at first. People had no idea that they were hours away from one of the most destructive aerial attacks in history. Then at exactly 10:03 p.m., the first wave of British Royal Air Force bombers arrived. More than 200 Lancaster bombers swept over the city in formation, dropping thousands of tons of high-explosive bombs and incendiaries. First came the explosives, designed to rip apart roofs, shatter windows, and expose the wooden interiors of homes and buildings. Then came the firebombs, small cylinders filled with a flammable mix of magnesium and petroleum jelly that ignited everything they touched. Within minutes, Dresden was ablaze, but that was just the beginning. The first wave left the city burning, its fire brigades overwhelmed, its air raid shelters filling with terrified civilians. 3 hours later, a second wave came, this time more than 500 bombers, and they dropped their payloads on a city already in flames. The fires merged, growing hotter and hotter, until they formed what is known as a firestorm. Temperatures reached over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire consumed all the oxygen in the area, creating hurricane-force winds that sucked people off the streets and into the flames. Survivors said that the fire seemed to breathe, pulling everything toward it with a roar like a living monster. Those who weren't burned alive suffocated as the air turned to smoke and poison gas. And still, it wasn't over. On February 14th, American bombers joined the assault in daylight raids, striking what little was left of the smoldering city and targeting anyone who had survived the night. Imagine walking out of a shelter after hours of screaming heat and darkness, thinking maybe you had lived through the worst, only to hear the drone of engines overhead and see another wave of bombs descending toward you. What happened in Dresden was not just a bombing, it was the creation of an artificial hell on earth. The firestorm was so intense that the asphalt on the streets melted. People who fell on it burned where they lay. In some places, entire families were fused together into charred lumps of flesh. In others, the heat was so great that bodies simply disintegrated into ash. There are accounts of mothers clutching babies who were burned into them, the outlines of their bodies seared together in death. The air was filled with a constant deafening roar, the sound of a city being consumed alive. When the fires finally died down, Dresden was gone. Almost everything, the churches, the museums, the opera house, the libraries, had been reduced to rubble and ash. And under that rubble lay the bodies of tens of thousands of people. Estimates of the death toll vary. Some say 25,000, others claim 35,000, and early German reports said as many as 200,000. But what is certain is that the destruction was catastrophic. Rescue crews found people who had fled to cellars and basements only to be baked alive as the heat turned their shelters into ovens. They found hundreds of bodies drowned in fountains and reservoirs. People who had tried to escape the flames by jumping into water, but had either boiled alive or suffocated in the toxic smoke. For weeks after the attack, workers struggled to clear the bodies. The stench of burning flesh hung over the city. There were so many corpses that they could not all be buried individually. Instead, they were stacked in huge piles and cremated in public squares. Survivors were left wandering among the ruins, searching for relatives who had vanished in the firestorm. Many never found them. There was simply nothing left to find. And here's where the story becomes even darker. Dresden had little military value. Yes, there were rail yards and communication lines, but critics have argued for decades that the bombing was not about military necessity. It was about sending a message, about terrorizing the German population into submission, about showing the Soviet Union the destructive power of Allied air forces just weeks before the war ended. Winston Churchill himself, after seeing the destruction, expressed unease, writing that he did not want to be remembered for mere acts of terror. But by then, it was too late. Dresden had become a symbol, not of Nazi power, but of what total war could do to civilians. For survivors, the memories of those nights never faded. Some spoke of the silence after the bombing, a silence so deep it felt unnatural, broken only by the crackling of fires and the distant cries of the wounded. Others spoke of the sky itself, black and red, raining ash and embers like snow, turning day into night. Children who lived through it grew up with nightmares, haunted by the image of people bursting into flames in the streets or being sucked into the firestorm's winds. The legacy of Dresden is complicated. Some historians defend the bombing, arguing that it hastened the end of the war and saved lives by preventing German reinforcements from reaching the Eastern Front. Others call it one of the greatest war crimes of the 20th century, an unnecessary massacre carried out when Germany was already on its knees. What is undeniable is that Dresden turned from a city of art and culture into a mass grave in less than 48 hours, and its destruction has left a scar that has never fully healed. If you ever visit Dresden today, you will see a rebuilt city, beautiful once more, its famous Frauenkirche restored stone by stone. But if you look closely, you will notice that some of the stones are darker than others, charred pieces of the original church that survived the firestorm. They serve as a silent reminder of what happened here, of the night when the sky turned to fire and tens of thousands of souls were lost. This is why the firebombing of Dresden remains one of history's darkest secrets, not because it was hidden, but because it forces us to confront what we are capable of in the name of victory. It makes us ask whether there are limits in war, or whether those limits are always broken when desperation sets in. It asks us whether we can call ourselves civilized when we unleash a storm of fire on a city full of refugees, when we create a hell so intense that even the ground catches fire. As we tell this story, I want you to remember that the people of Dresden were not soldiers. They were mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, people who just wanted to survive the war. Their screams were drowned out by the roar of bombers, their city became their tomb, and their memory lives on as a warning. If this story has shaken you, if it has made you question the meaning of war, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story we uncover. Like this video to spread the truth, share it with someone who needs to know what happened in Dresden, and leave a comment. Do you think this was a necessary act of war, or an atrocity that should never have happened? The ghosts of Dresden are still whispering through history, and by telling their story, we make sure they are never silenced again. If you're still with me right now, you can feel just how heavy and terrifying this story is, and there's still so much more to uncover. Before we go deeper into the darkest part of this tragedy, do me a quick favor. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss more stories like this. Give this video a like if it's opening your eyes to history they never taught us, and drop a comment below with your thoughts so far. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this with someone who needs to know what really happened. Now, let's go even deeper into the nightmare. Imagine this: the year is 1945, the Second World War is finally ending. Hitler is dead, the Third Reich has crumbled, and the Allies are marching into a ruined Germany. The world is breathing a sigh of relief, thinking that the nightmare is over. But beneath the rubble, a new and far stranger story is about to begin, one that would secretly reshape science, warfare, and even space exploration for decades to come. A story that sounds like something ripped from the pages of a conspiracy novel, but is entirely chillingly real. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, America's top-secret program to recruit Nazi scientists, smuggle them out of Germany, and put them to work in the United States. And as we uncover this dark chapter, I want you to imagine the moral weight of what happened. Scientists who had worked for Hitler, some of whom were implicated in war crimes, being given new identities, new homes, and even celebrated careers, not in hiding, but in plain sight, all under the watchful eye of the US government. It started as a desperate race between former allies who had just defeated the Nazis but were already preparing for the next global struggle, the Cold War. The Americans knew that Germany's scientific establishment was decades ahead in certain fields: rocketry, aeronautics, chemical weapons, even medicine. And they were terrified that if the Soviets captured these scientists first, the balance of power would tip in Moscow's favor. So what did the United States do? They launched an operation to hunt these scientists down, not to put them on trial, but to offer them a deal. Work for us, or risk being taken by someone else, someone much worse. The most famous of these scientists was Wernher von Braun, the man who had built the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. During the war, the V-2 was used to rain destruction on London and Antwerp, killing thousands. It was built using slave labor at the Middelwerk underground factory, where prisoners from concentration camps were worked to death under horrific conditions. Survivors later testified that thousands of forced laborers were beaten, starved, and executed in the tunnels where the rockets were assembled. And yet, when the war was over, von Braun and his team were not charged with crimes. Instead, they were whisked away to America, given comfortable jobs, and eventually helped design the rockets that took the United States to the moon. Picture this: the same man who stood in Hitler's office, showing him the V-2 rocket plans, later standing next to Walt Disney on television, smiling and explaining the future of space travel to American children. That is the strange duality of Operation Paperclip, the blending of horror and hope, the moral compromise of a nation willing to forgive almost anything in exchange for scientific progress. Operation Paperclip was not small. Over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States between 1945 and the late 1950s. Many of them were members of the Nazi Party. Some were SS officers, and some were directly involved in human experimentation or weapons programs that had caused mass death. Their files were sanitized, their pasts were whitewashed, and they were given new lives. But the secrecy ran deeper than most people realize. This wasn't just about building rockets. It was about chemical and biological warfare, about intelligence operations, about psychological research. Some of the men recruited under Paperclip went on to work in the very programs that would later become infamous, like MKUltra, the CIA's mind control experiments. Others worked on developing new weapons for the Korean War and later conflicts. In many cases, the public never knew their names or their pasts. Imagine the scene: 1945, deep inside a bombed-out German research facility. American intelligence officers sift through documents, pull open filing cabinets, and find blueprints for weapons years ahead of anything the Allies had. Then they find the scientists themselves, some eager to surrender, others hiding, fearful of retribution. These men are questioned, vetted, and then quietly offered a chance to start over. Some are flown out of Germany under cover of night. Others are kept in secret camps, interrogated for months before being shipped to places like Fort Bliss, Texas, or White Sands, New Mexico, where they begin working for the US Army. The American public was never told the full truth at the time. To most people, the German scientists in America were simply brilliant minds who had been captured and now served the cause of freedom. But what they didn't know was that some of these men had been involved in the Nazi war machine's darkest projects that experimented on human beings, projects that relied on forced labor, projects that left behind a trail of corpses. This is where the story becomes morally disturbing. Was it right to bring these men to America, to give them new lives when many of their victims never got justice? Survivors of the Mittelbau-Dora camp, where the V-2 rockets were built, lived the rest of their lives with the memories of the horrors they saw. People hanged in the tunnels, bodies lying in the mud, while the men responsible for those rockets became celebrated pioneers. And the secrecy didn't just end with the recruitment. For years, the US government denied the very existence of Operation Paperclip. Documents were classified, questions were deflected. It wasn't until decades later, when files were declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, that the public began to learn the full scale of what had been done. The revelations were explosive. Evidence that Nazi scientists had been protected, their war crimes overlooked, simply because they were useful. But this story also has another layer: the space race. Without the scientists of Operation Paperclip, America might not have landed on the moon in 1969. Wernher von Braun became the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that carried Apollo astronauts into space. His name is still celebrated at NASA facilities, but it carries with it a shadow. Every Saturn V launch, every American flag planted on the lunar surface, was built on a foundation that began in the darkness of a Nazi weapons program. Operation Paperclip forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about history: that sometimes victory is not just about defeating an enemy, but about absorbing their knowledge, even if it means absorbing their sins. It is a story that blurs the line between good and evil, between justice and pragmatism. And then there's the human side, the scientists themselves. Some of them were true believers in Nazi ideology. Others claimed they had no choice but to serve the regime. In America, many of them built new lives, raised families, became respected citizens. Some even expressed gratitude for being given a second chance. But the question lingers: did they ever feel guilt? Did they think about the prisoners who died building their rockets, or the victims of the weapons they designed? Or did they simply bury the past and move forward, as their new country asked them to do? The more you dig into Operation Paperclip, the darker it becomes. You find names like Hubertus Strughold, the so-called father of space medicine, who had been linked to experiments on prisoners at Dachau. You find connections to chemical weapons programs, to nerve gas research, to Cold War biological weapons development. You begin to realize that this was not just a story about rockets. It was a story about how far a nation will go to get ahead, even if it means embracing those it once called enemies. And perhaps that is why Operation Paperclip remains such a haunting story. Because it asks a question that is as relevant today as it was in 1945. How much are we willing to compromise our morals for the sake of progress, for the sake of security, for the sake of winning? When you stand back and look at the entire picture, you see a chilling pattern. The war ends. The world celebrates the defeat of Nazi Germany. And then, almost immediately, the victors begin to carve up the spoils. Not just land and resources, but knowledge, technology, human capital. The same scientists who once built weapons for Hitler are now building weapons and dreams for America. Today, you can visit museums and see V-2 rockets on display, marvel at their sleek design, and read about how they were the ancestors of modern space travel. But those rockets were born in darkness. They were built with the blood of prisoners, and the men who designed them were not held accountable. They were rewarded. This is what makes Operation Paperclip one of history's most unsettling secrets. It's not just about what was done, it's about what was hidden and why. It's about the selective memory of nations, about the uncomfortable truths that get buried because they are too inconvenient, too damaging to the myth of moral clarity. So the next time you look at a photograph of Apollo 11 lifting off, or hear the name Wernher von Braun, remember the tunnels of Mittelwerk, the prisoners who never came out, the decision made in the chaos of 1945 to bring the minds behind those weapons to America, and ask yourself, why would you have made the same decision? Would you have taken the knowledge knowing the cost, or would you have said no, even if it meant letting your enemies take the lead? Operation Paperclip is a story without easy answers, a story that forces us to confront the price of progress, It is a reminder that history is not always a battle between good and evil, but sometimes a murky, gray struggle where choices are made in the shadows. Knowledge is power, and now you hold a piece of history that millions still don't know. Let's change that. Hit that subscribe button to join a community that refuses to let the past be forgotten. Give this video a like if you believe the world needs to hear this. Leave a comment to add your voice to the conversation. And share this video with someone who needs to learn what really happened. Together we make sure the truth lives on. There are some stories so dark, so horrifying that it's hard to believe they really happened. Stories that make you question how human beings could ever be capable of such cruelty. We are traveling back to the heart of Africa, to a place once known as the Congo Free State, though it was anything but free, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is the story of how an entire country was turned into the private property of one man, King Leopold II of Belgium, and how that man's hunger for profit created one of the deadliest, most nightmarish chapters in human history. This is the story of the Congolese rubber atrocities, a time when millions of men, women, and children were enslaved, tortured, mutilated, and slaughtered, all in the name of rubber and ivory, all to make one man and his empire rich. And as you listen, I want you to imagine what it would have been like to live through it, to wake up every day knowing that if you failed to meet a quota, your wife could be taken hostage, your children could be killed, or your hands could be chopped off as punishment. It began in the 1880s, when European powers carved up Africa at the infamous Berlin Conference. King Leopold II, eager to expand Belgium's influence, convinced the world that he was taking control of the Congo for humanitarian reasons, to bring civilization, Christianity, and trade to what he called the dark heart of Africa. In reality, Leopold had no interest in uplifting the Congolese people. He wanted wealth. He wanted land. And above all, he wanted rubber. The late 19th century saw an explosion in demand for rubber, driven by the invention of the bicycle tire, then the automobile, and later all kinds of industrial uses. The Congo was rich in wild rubber vines, and Leopold saw an opportunity to create a personal fortune. But to get that fortune, he needed labor, cheap, reliable, and brutally efficient. And so the Congo Free State became a massive forced labor camp. Villages were ordered to meet impossible quotas of rubber collection. Men were sent into the jungle to gather latex, and if they failed to bring back enough, the punishments were beyond cruel. Soldiers of the Force Publique, Leopold's private army, would storm into villages, burning houses, taking hostages, killing indiscriminately. In some cases, they would chop off the hands of the men who failed to collect enough rubber. And not just the men. Women, children, even babies had their hands severed. Soldiers were actually required to show severed hands as proof that they had not wasted bullets. Try to picture that. Imagine being a parent, forced to watch as your child's hand is hacked off and held up like a grotesque trophy, all because someone in your village didn't bring enough rubber. Imagine walking through the forest and stumbling upon baskets filled with human hands rotting in the sun, because this was not just punishment, it was policy. The terror was systematic, calculated, designed to break the will of the Congolese people and force them to work harder, and the death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that between 10 and 15 million Congolese people died during Leopold's rule, some from direct violence, others from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. That is one of the largest death tolls of any atrocity in modern history, rivaling some of the worst genocides. Entire villages were wiped out. Survivors were left scarred both physically and mentally. The population of the Congo was literally cut in half in just a few decades. The atrocities were so shocking that even in an age when colonialism was accepted, they sparked international outrage. Missionaries and travelers who witnessed the horrors began smuggling out reports, photographs, and even severed hands as evidence. One of the most famous whistleblowers was E.D. Morel, a British shipping clerk who noticed that ships going to the Congo were full of guns and ammunition, while ships returning were filled with rubber and ivory. He realized that this was not trade, and it was plunder enforced at gunpoint. Morel began a campaign to expose what was happening, joined by others like Roger Casement, who wrote a damning report on the conditions in the Congo. But for decades, Leopold denied everything. He claimed he was a philanthropist, that he was bringing light to Africa. He built monuments to himself in Belgium, presenting himself as a great humanitarian. Meanwhile, in the Congo, men were being whipped with the shikut, a brutal whip made of hippopotamus hide that could cut through skin with every lash. Victims were often whipped until their bones were visible. Women were taken as hostages and raped. Children were executed as examples. Some villages resorted to eating their dead to survive. And through it all, Leopold grew richer and richer. The profits from the Congo built grand buildings in Brussels, funded palaces, museums, and monuments. Belgium flourished, but it flourished on a mountain of corpses. When the truth could no longer be hidden, international pressure finally forced Leopold to give up personal control of the Congo in 1908, transferring it to the Belgian government. But by then, the damage was done. The Congo was a shattered land, its people traumatized, its population decimated. The scars of that period can still be felt today, in the political instability, the poverty, the deep mistrust of outside powers. If you go to Congo today, you can still find traces of that era. Abandoned rubber vines, rusted chains, crumbling colonial outposts. But the real ghosts are the stories passed down through generations. Grandparents telling grandchildren about the time when men with guns came and burned their villages, when people were forced to choose between death and slavery, when every day was a fight just to stay alive. What makes the Congolese rubber atrocities one of the darkest chapters in human history is not just the scale of the killing, it's the cold, calculated way it was carried out. This was not chaos. This was a system, an organized machine of exploitation designed to squeeze as much profit as possible from human suffering. It shows us how far greed can go, how easily morality can be thrown aside when money is involved, and how entire nations can be complicit in crimes if the rewards are great enough. And perhaps the most chilling part is that for decades, this story was almost forgotten. In Belgium, Leopold was still celebrated as a king who brought glory to the nation. Statues of him stood in public squares. Streets were named after him. It is only in recent years that people have begun to confront the truth, to question why a man responsible for millions of deaths should be honored at all. As you hear this story, I want you to imagine the Congo of 120 years ago, the dense jungle, the sounds of drums, the cries of children, the crack of gunfire, the smell of smoke and blood in the air. Imagine the fear that never went away, the hopelessness of knowing that no one was coming to save you, that the outside world did not care, and then remember that this was not ancient history. This happened in the age of cameras, telegraphs, and steamships. The evidence was there. The world simply chose to look away for far too long. If this story has shocked you, if it has made you feel anger or sadness, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss more untold stories like this. Like this video to spread awareness. Share it with someone who needs to know what happened in the Congo, because stories like this should never be forgotten. And leave a comment telling me what you think. Should King Leopold II be remembered as a builder of Belgium, or as one of history's greatest criminals? Because the ghosts of the Congo are still with us. They are still whispering in the rustling of the rubber trees, still crying out from the rivers that carried their blood away. And tonight we have listened to them. We are traveling back to the years 1932 and 1933, to the wide, fertile plains of Ukraine, a land known as the breadbasket of Europe, a land of golden fields and proud farmers, where generations had cultivated the soil and lived off the fruits of their labor. But during these 2 years, Ukraine became a place of unimaginable horror, a place where millions of people starved to death, where families were torn apart by hunger, and where the very earth seemed to conspire against its people. This was the Holodomor, a famine orchestrated not by nature but by human hands, by policies designed to extract wealth, suppress independence, and crush a people. And as you hear this story, I want you to imagine what it was like to live through it, to wake up each day with an emptiness in your stomach so deep it feels like it is hollowing out your chest, to see neighbors wasting away before your eyes, to face impossible choices about survival and morality. It begins in the early 1930s, when the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was undergoing radical changes. The government launched a campaign of forced collectivization, attempting to bring the independent farms of Ukraine under state control. For centuries, Ukrainian peasants had worked small plots of land, growing enough grain to feed themselves, sell at local markets, and sustain their families. But collectivization demanded that they surrender their land, their livestock, and their autonomy to the state. Resistance was treated as treason. Farmers who hid grain or refused to join collective farms were labeled as kulaks, enemies of the people, and faced arrest, deportation, or execution. The authorities imposed impossible quotas for grain collection, demanding more than the peasants could ever produce. Agents of the state scoured villages, taking every last kernel of wheat, rye, and corn. The result was catastrophic. Fields that once fed entire families were emptied, and the grain was shipped to cities or exported abroad to fund Soviet industrialization, leaving the Ukrainian peasantry with nothing. No bread, no seed for the next planting season, just starvation. By mid-1932, the famine had begun in earnest. Villages were quiet in the daytime, but alive with whispers of desperation. People scavenged for anything to eat. Tree bark, grass, roots, and even the hideous thought of cannibalism crept into the minds of those driven to the edge. Reports from that time tell of children wandering alone in the fields, their eyes hollow, their skin stretched over bones like parchment. Families huddled together in their homes, too weak to cook or work, listening to the groans of neighbors through thin walls. Some parents abandoned children to save themselves, leaving infants to die alone in the cold. The famine was deliberate. Stalin's regime refused to provide relief. Borders were sealed, preventing peasants from seeking food elsewhere. Internal passports were enforced to keep starving villagers trapped in their regions. Officials punished anyone caught trying to steal food from warehouses or hoard what little they could save, and the violence didn't stop there. Anyone resisting the quotas, hiding grain, or speaking out against the authorities risked imprisonment, deportation to labor camps, or execution. The state turned its bureaucratic machinery into a weapon, using starvation as a tool of political terror. Imagine the sights of Ukraine during those months. Entire villages emptied as people either perished or fled in search of food. Roads were littered with corpses. Parents carried their dead children from home to home, seeking aid that never came. Some starved to death in barns under the very roofs that once sheltered them. The winter of 1932-1933 only made matters worse. Freezing temperatures combined with hunger, creating a deadly cocktail that few could survive. Bodies that had once belonged to strong men and women became nothing but fragile husks. Eyewitness accounts from survivors are harrowing. People described the groans of the dying echoing through the night. The sight of neighbors digging graves for family members who had simply collapsed in the streets, the unbearable smell of death, mixed with the scent of frozen soil. Children were found crawling on all fours, too weak to walk, searching desperately for food. Parents, their eyes sunken, wandered from village to village, holding on to hope that someone might have a scrap of bread, only to return home empty-handed, their children already gone. The psychological toll was immense. Fear, despair, and grief were constant companions. The scale of death is staggering. Historians estimate that between 3 and 7 million Ukrainians perished during the Holodomor. Entire communities were wiped out. Some villages lost 50 to 75% of their population. The famine disproportionately affected the countryside, where people were directly subjected to grain requisitions and state violence. Urban populations suffered less because the state prioritized feeding workers and exporting food abroad. And all the while, Soviet propaganda portrayed Ukraine as thriving, reporting bumper crops and success stories, masking the human catastrophe unfolding in front of the world. Starvation created horrors beyond imagination. In some desperate cases, people turned on one another. Mothers abandoned infants by the roadside. Children were sold for a few grains of maize, and instances of cannibalism were recorded. Acts driven not by malice, but by the sheer instinct to survive. The famine did not discriminate. Men, women, the elderly, and children all suffered. Every day was a battle against the body itself. Those who survived for weeks often emerged traumatized, their physical strength gone and their spirits broken. The international community largely remained silent, unaware or unwilling to confront the Soviet Union. Some journalists and diplomats tried to report the famine, but their accounts were often dismissed or censored. The USSR denied the existence of any crisis, blocking foreign aid and punishing anyone attempting to document the suffering. And within Ukraine, fear kept people from speaking out. To criticize the state or even acknowledge the famine could be a death sentence. This created an eerie, suffocating atmosphere, a nation dying in silence, its suffering hidden by both government policy and terror. By 1933, the famine reached its peak. Fields lay empty, rivers carried bodies, and homes were abandoned. Survivors describe walking through the countryside, unable to find a living soul, only skeletons and corpses frozen in the snow. Those who tried to flee to neighboring regions were stopped by armed guards, their movements restricted by internal passports and military checkpoints. In essence, Ukraine had become a massive prison, with the government holding life and death over its prisoners. The aftermath was devastating. When the famine finally subsided, millions were gone. Children who survived were left orphaned and traumatized. Families had been broken, villages depopulated, and the psychological scars would last generations. Ukrainian culture, identity, and society were deeply affected as the memory of starvation and oppression became woven into the national consciousness. Scholars argue that the Holodomor was not merely a famine caused by bad weather or poor planning. It was a deliberate policy of repression, a tool used by Stalin to crush Ukrainian nationalism and consolidate Soviet control. The Holodomor remains one of the most harrowing examples of how political power can manipulate nature and agriculture to commit mass murder. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human cruelty, state control, and the manipulation of resources as weapons against entire populations. It asks us to ask difficult questions. How could the world have allowed this to happen? How could millions die while the machinery of government continued to operate, exporting grain and enforcing quotas? How do we reconcile human progress with such atrocities? And yet, the story of the Holodomor is also a story of resilience. Despite the unimaginable suffering, the Ukrainian people survived. They rebuilt, they remembered, and they passed down the memory of those years, ensuring that the world would not forget the horror. Even today, Ukraine honors the victims, teaching new generations about the famine, commemorating the dead, and warning the world of the consequences of unchecked power. Picture the fields of Ukraine today, golden waves of wheat and sunflowers swaying in the wind. Beneath the beauty lies memory, a reminder of how a nation's lifeblood was taken, how millions perished, and how silence, fear, and political calculation can be as deadly as any weapon. The Holodomor is a testament to human suffering, and a chilling warning about what happens when a state treats its people not as citizens, but as expendable resources. If this story has left you breathless, shocked, or deeply moved, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you never miss more untold stories of human history's darkest moments. Like this video to help spread awareness, share it with someone who may not know about the Holodomor, and leave a comment below. What do you think about a government willing to starve millions of its own people to consolidate power? Could you imagine living in a world where neighbors vanish in silence, where every meal is a fight against death and every day is a countdown toward an inevitable end? The ghosts of the Holodomor are still with us, whispering from the fields, reminding the world that even in silence, history never forgets. There are moments in history so dark, so horrific that they defy belief. Moments when humanity seems to have abandoned itself entirely, leaving only terror, chaos, and death. We travel back to the winter of 1937, to the ancient city of Nanking, China, a city of culture, history, and life, where in just a matter of weeks, tens of thousands of people would be slaughtered, humiliated, and broken in what is now known as the Nanking Massacre. This is a story of unimaginable cruelty, of a city turned into a living nightmare, and of a people left to endure horrors that seem almost impossible to describe. And as you listen, I want you to feel the tension of that time, to imagine the fear that gripped the streets, the sounds of boots on cobblestones, the whistling of bullets, and the screams of those trapped in a city that had become a prison of death. It began in December 1937. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, Japanese forces had invaded China, advancing steadily southward. Nanking, the capital of the Republic of China, was seen as a strategic and symbolic prize. Its walls had once protected emperors and scholars. Now they were about to witness a horror beyond imagination. The Chinese army, poorly equipped and vastly outnumbered, was retreating, leaving civilians behind, thousands of soldiers captured and bound for an unknown fate. And then, as the city fell, the Japanese troops began their occupation. an occupation that would quickly turn into one of the most notorious massacres in modern history. The invasion of Nanking was not simply a military campaign. It was accompanied by a deliberate and systematic campaign of terror. Japanese soldiers went from street to street, home to home, rounding up men, women, and children. No one was safe. Men were executed en masse, often after being tortured. Women were subjected to mass rape, humiliation, and murder. Children were not spared. The methods were brutal and unrestrained. Bayonets, rifles, swords, and fire were used indiscriminately. Some were burned alive, others buried in shallow mass graves while still conscious. Entire families vanished overnight, leaving behind homes filled with blood and silence. The scale of the atrocity is staggering. Historians estimate that over 6 weeks, between 200,000 and 300,000 people were killed. Tens of thousands of women were raped, many of them gang-raped repeatedly before being murdered. Soldiers executed captives along the Yangtze River, forcing prisoners to march into the water before opening fire, drowning entire groups. Others were subjected to cruel experiments and displays of sadistic violence designed to instill fear. Officers often treated the massacre as sport, competing with each other to kill the most people or perform the most gruesome acts. Imagine walking through Nanking during those days. The streets, once bustling with merchants and students, are now silent, except for the sound of boots, the cries of the captured, and the occasional roar of gunfire. Houses are empty, or occupied by the soldiers who use them as makeshift prisons or torture chambers. Fires burn in the distance, smoke curling into the sky, carrying the stench of death. Survivors report bodies littering the streets, some piled in heaps, others lying face down in pools of blood, the snow turning red as it melts. For anyone trapped in the city, there is no escape. Curfews are enforced by machine gun patrols. Anyone attempting to flee is shot on sight. The psychological horror is as profound as the physical one. Families are torn apart, children witnessing the execution of parents, siblings witnessing the violation of one another. The soldiers' cruelty is not just systematic. It is personal, designed to terrorize and break the human spirit. Some victims were forced to dig their own graves before being shot. Others were humiliated publicly, forced to kneel or crawl while soldiers mocked and tortured them. The massacre was comprehensive, encompassing every form of violence imaginable, from sexual assault to summary execution, from mutilation to arson. Despite the chaos, there were small acts of humanity. Some foreigners, diplomats, and missionaries organized a safety zone, providing shelter to tens of thousands of civilians. But even these zones could not prevent the violence entirely. Soldiers often ignored the boundaries, hunting down anyone they could catch, and fear permeated even these supposed havens. For those trapped outside, survival often depended on luck, ingenuity, or the mercy of the very people who were supposed to be their executioners. The massacre left scars not just on Nanking, but on history itself. Entire neighborhoods were wiped out. The population was decimated, and cultural landmarks were destroyed or defiled. Temples and schools were looted or burned. Businesses vanished overnight. The survivors were left with physical injuries, psychological trauma, and the deep grief of knowing that loved ones had been lost in the most violent and senseless ways imaginable. International reaction was slow, muted by distance and political complications. Reports from missionaries and journalists eventually made their way abroad, shocking the world with accounts of mass killings, rapes, and torture. But at the time, the Japanese military controlled the narrative, denying atrocities and labeling any reports as exaggeration or propaganda. The truth was hidden behind censorship, fear, and political expediency. It would take decades for the full scale of Nanking to be recognized and remembered. The horror of the Nanking massacre lies not only in the numbers, but in the cruelty, the premeditation, and the complete disregard for human life. This was not the chaos of war. This was organized terror, an intentional campaign of murder designed to humiliate, subjugate, and terrorize. For 6 weeks, Nanking became a city where life was devalued, where morality was suspended, and where the ordinary rules of human decency were obliterated. Survivor accounts bring the terror to life. People describe walking streets lined with corpses, the cold winter air carrying the smell of burning flesh. Women speak of being forced to endure the same violence day after day, of seeing their friends and relatives killed in front of them. Men who were captured as soldiers describe execution squads and the constant threat of death. Children, the most innocent victims, were often forced to witness or participate in atrocities, leaving them scarred for life. And yet, Nanking survived. The city eventually rebuilt, its streets repopulated, its culture restored. But the memory of the massacre remains, a permanent scar in the collective consciousness of China and the world. Every monument, every museum, every survivor's testimony is a reminder of the depths to which humanity can sink, and a warning of what happens when power is unchecked, when cruelty is permitted to flourish, and when human life is treated as expendable. The legacy of the Nanking Massacre is complicated. Some deny or minimize it, but the overwhelming historical evidence, survivor testimonies, photographs, contemporary reports, leaves no room for doubt. It serves as a case study in wartime atrocities, in the deliberate use of terror as a weapon, and in the importance of historical memory. It also underscores the resilience of those who survive such horrors, the courage of those who risk their lives to protect others, and the enduring human need to bear witness. Tonight, as we recount the events of Nanking, imagine the city in its final days before the massacre, the soldiers approaching, the civilians trying desperately to hide, the streets turning silent with fear. Then imagine the horror that followed. 6 weeks of terror, the sounds of screams, gunfire, and despair echoing through the night. Imagine the psychological trauma, the physical suffering, and the lasting scars left on a city, a nation, and the world. This is why the Nanking Massacre remains one of history's most haunting episodes, not because it was a battle lost or won, but because it was a deliberate act of dehumanization, of mass violence inflicted on civilians, of cruelty carried out on an unimaginable scale. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about war, power, and human nature. It asks us to remember that the cost of conflict is not measured solely in territory or victory, but in the lives destroyed and the innocents lost. If this story has held you in its grip, made you shiver with horror, or left you questioning the capacity for human cruelty, subscribe to this channel so you never miss more stories of history's darkest secrets. Like this video to ensure others can witness the truth. Share it with someone who needs to understand the cost of war, and leave a comment. How do you reconcile the human capacity for progress and culture with the capacity for such unthinkable violence? The streets of Nanking whisper their secrets even today, reminding us that while cities may be rebuilt, memory endures. Because history is not only what we build, it is also what we must never forget. And the massacre of Nanking is a story that demands to be remembered, felt, and understood, so that we never allow such horrors to happen again. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. But the darkness doesn't end here. History is full of hidden horrors, buried secrets, and mysteries that are just waiting to be uncovered. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, then you're going to love what we have coming next. Make sure you subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and drop a comment telling us which part of this story chilled you the most. We read every single one. And if you think you know someone who needs to hear this, share this video with them, because this isn't the last time we step into the shadows, and there are more secrets, more dark truths, and more mysteries we're going to expose together. The next one might just be even darker than this.